At 65, I was living in my car while my own son told people I had chosen to disappear. I didn't cry when I said it. I didn't even pause. By that point, I had learned that the truth didn't need drama. It just needed to be told at the right time. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it really began. My name is Margaret Collins. I turned 65 in late October, on a quiet Tuesday that no one in my family acknowledged. No calls. No cards. Not even a text message. I spent that morning sitting in the driver's seat of my old 2008 Toyota Camry, parked behind a grocery store off Route 9, watching people load their carts with things I used to buy without thinking. Milk, fresh bread, flowers in plastic sleeves. The kind of small comforts that feel invisible until they're gone. The nights were getting colder by then. I kept a wool coat folded in the passenger seat, using it as a blanket when the temperature dropped into the low 40s. I learned how to angle the car just right so the streetlight wouldn't shine directly into my eyes. I learned which parking spots were less likely to attract attention. I learned how to make myself smaller. Invisible. That part came easier than I expected, because by then, I already was invisible. To my own family, at least. Daniel, my son, lived less than 15 miles away in a 2-story house I had helped him afford. I still remembered the day we closed on it. He had hugged me in the driveway, his voice thick with gratitude. I couldn't have done this without you, Mom. Back then, I believed him. I believed a lot of things. Like how family meant you never had to wonder where you stood. Like how sacrifice came back around in the form of love. Like how a mother didn't have to earn her place in her own child's life. I was wrong about all of that. It didn't happen all at once. That's the part people never understand. There wasn't a single moment where everything broke. It was quieter than that. Slower. Conversations that became shorter. Invitations that stopped coming. Holidays that somehow got rescheduled without me. At first, I told myself it was just life. People get busy. Families grow. Things change. Then Sophia came into the picture. My daughter-in-law. She had a way of smiling that never quite reached her eyes. Polite. Measured. Careful. The kind of smile that looks warm from a distance, but feels cold when you're standing right in front of it. She was the one who started suggesting that maybe I needed more independence. That maybe it was time I found a place of my own. I didn't argue. I never argued. I had spent my whole life keeping the peace, smoothing over tension, making sure everyone else felt comfortable. It's a habit that doesn't disappear overnight. So when Daniel stopped returning my calls, I told myself he was busy. When Sophia stopped including me in family dinners, I told myself she was overwhelmed. When my things began disappearing from their house, little things at first, like my extra set of keys or the drawer where I kept my paperwork, I told myself it was just a misunderstanding. Until the day I came back from running errands and found my suitcase sitting on the front porch. Neatly packed. Zipped. Waiting. There was no note. No explanation. Just the door, closed behind it. I stood there for a long time, staring at that suitcase like it belonged to someone else. Like if I waited long enough, the door would open and Daniel would laugh and say it was all a mistake. It didn't happen. Instead, the porch light flicked on. And then off again. That was the moment I understood something had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. I didn't knock. I didn't call. I picked up the suitcase, walked back to my car, and drove away without a word. The next morning, I went to the bank. Not because I had a plan, but because something in me, quiet, steady, and very awake, told me I needed to start paying attention. Because if my own family could erase me that easily, then maybe they had been rewriting the story for a long time. And I had just never noticed. I did not go back to that house. Not the next day. Not the day after. There are some doors you only have to see close once to understand they were never really open for you to begin with. Instead, I stayed in the car and began to learn the rhythm of a life I never imagined I would have at 60. 5. Mornings started early because sleeping past sunrise meant drawing attention. I would sit up slowly, fold my coat, and check the mirrors out of habit more than fear. Then I would drive to a gas station 2 miles away where the clerk never asked questions. $5 bought me a cup of coffee and a few quiet minutes in a place where no one knew my name. I learned which public restrooms were clean, which ones opened early, and which ones stayed unlocked long enough for me to wash my face and fix my hair. I kept a small toiletry bag under the seat, organized in a way that made me feel like I still had control over something. Control becomes important when everything else slips away. During the day, I rotated between parking lots. Libraries were the best. Warm in the winter, cool in the afternoon, and quiet enough that no one noticed how long you stayed. I would sit at a corner table, pretending to read while I listened. People talk more than they realize. Conversations about vacations, about promotions, about family dinners. Words that used to feel normal now sounded like stories from a life I used to belong to. I never said I was homeless. I never said I was struggling. I simply existed between spaces, careful not to leave a mark. The strange thing is, I still had a family. At least on paper. Daniel was still my son. Sophia was still my daughter-in-law. They were still living in that house I had helped build into something beautiful. And from what I could tell, their life had not slowed down at all. In fact, it seemed to be improving. I saw it first on my phone. I had almost stopped checking it, but one afternoon in the library, curiosity got the better of me. I opened social media, and there they were. Smiling. Hosting dinners. Posting pictures of perfectly set tables and weekend gatherings. Friends filled the comments with admiration. You have such a beautiful home. Family goals. So warm and inviting. I stared at those words longer than I should have. Warm and inviting. I tried to match that image with the memory of my suitcase sitting on the porch. It did not fit. What caught my attention was not just what they posted, but what they said. Sophia had written a caption under one of the photos. Grateful for a peaceful home and the chance to start fresh after a difficult year. A difficult year. I read that sentence again, slowly this time. The language was careful, vague enough to invite sympathy, specific enough to suggest a story. But it was not my story, not the one I was living. A few posts later, I found something else. A comment from one of their friends asking about me. Just a simple question. How is your mom doing these days? I felt my chest tighten as I read Sophia's reply. She needed space. She decided to go her own way for a while. We are respecting that. I closed the app after that. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because something inside me had shifted into place. Clear, precise, quiet. They had not just pushed me out. They had rewritten the reason. They had created a version of events where I had chosen to leave, where they were supportive, patient, understanding. It was not anger that settled in me. It was something colder than that, something steadier. Because once you see a lie clearly enough, you stop reacting to it emotionally. You start examining it. I sat there in that library, watching people move around me, and began to replay everything in my mind. The conversations, the timing, the small details I had dismissed, the missing keys, the subtle shifts in tone, the way decisions were made without me, and then explained as if I had agreed to them. It was not sudden. It was designed. And for the first time since I picked up that suitcase, I understood that this was not just about being unwanted. It was about something they did not want me to see. And whatever that was, they were counting on me to stay quiet long enough for their version to become the only one anyone believed. Once you start looking at something closely enough, the past does not stay in the past. It rearranges itself. Details you once ignored begin to stand out, sharp and undeniable. I spent that afternoon in the library going back through messages I had saved without thinking they would ever matter. Old texts from Daniel. Short, polite, distant. We will talk later, Mom. Busy this week. Let us plan something soon. Soon never came. Then there were emails. Practical ones. Conversations about bills, repairs, small financial matters tied to the house. At the time, they felt routine. Now they felt different. I noticed how often my name had been included in things that slowly stopped including me. Utility accounts, insurance paperwork, property documents. My role had not disappeared all at once. It had been reduced, piece by piece. I opened a message from nearly a year ago. Daniel had asked me to review some paperwork. He said it was just an update. Something about refinancing to get a better rate. I remembered signing it at the kitchen table. Sophia had stood nearby, smiling, explaining how it would help everyone in the long run. I had trusted them. There was no reason not to. At least that is what I told myself back then. I read through the attachment again, this time slowly, line by line. The language was formal, dense, easy to skim if you believed the people handing it to you had your best interests in mind. But I did not skim anymore. I traced each sentence carefully, feeling something tighten in my chest as the meaning became clearer. My name was still there, but not in the way I expected. It was not listed as an owner anymore. It was listed as a prior party, someone who had transferred interest. I sat back in the chair, staring at the screen without blinking. I did not feel shocked. Not exactly. It was more like recognition. Like finally seeing the full picture after looking at scattered pieces for too long. The missing keys. The conversations I was not included in. The sudden urgency to update documents. The way decisions were presented as already made. It had not been about giving me independence. It had been about removing me from something I once had a claim to. And once that was done, once everything was in their names alone, there was no longer a reason for me to stay. I closed the document and rested my hands on the table. Around me, people turned pages, typed quietly, lived their lives without interruption. The normal rhythm of the world continued as if nothing had changed. But for me, everything had. I thought about the suitcase again. How neatly it had been packed. Not rushed. Not careless. Planned. That was the word that kept returning to me. Planned. This had been decided long. Before I ever stood on that porch. Long before I realized I was being moved out of my own life. I opened my phone again, not to scroll this time, but to search. Public records are not hidden. Not if you know where to look. It took time. Addresses. Dates. Filings. Each piece confirming what I already suspected. The property had been fully transferred months ago. My name removed. My connection erased in a way that would look clean and legitimate to anyone who did not know the story behind it. I did not feel anger rising. I expected it, but it did not come. What came instead was clarity. A steady, quiet understanding that what had been done to me was not an accident. It was a decision. And decisions leave traces. People think that if something is written down in the right format, signed in the right place, witnessed by the right people, then it becomes unquestionable. But documents do not erase truth. They just hide it behind language. I gathered my things slowly, placing my phone back in my bag, folding my coat with the same care I used every morning. There was no urgency in my movements. No panic. Because for the first time since all of this began, I was not reacting anymore. I was observing. And observation has a way of turning into understanding. As I walked out of the library and into the late afternoon light, I realized something simple but important. They believed the story was finished. They believed I had disappeared into the background, just like they told everyone. But I was still here. I was paying attention. And the truth, once you see it clearly enough, has a way of refusing to stay hidden. That night, I did not drive far. There was a quiet stretch of road just past a closed hardware store where the lights stayed dim and the traffic faded after 9. I parked there, turned off the engine, and sat in the stillness for a long time, letting everything settle into place. It is one thing to suspect something is wrong. It is another to see it clearly, without excuses, without softened edges. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. I leaned back in the driver's seat and looked up through the windshield at the dark sky, thinking about all the times I had chosen not to look too closely, not because I was unaware, but because I wanted to believe something better. That is the quiet danger of love when it is tied to family. It teaches you to overlook patterns that would be obvious if they came from anyone else. I thought about the first time Sophia mentioned simplifying things. It had sounded harmless at the time. Sensible, even. She said it gently, with that careful tone she always used when presenting an idea that was already decided. It would just make everything easier for you, she had said, standing in the kitchen with a cup of tea she never drank. I remembered how Daniel had nodded beside her, not looking at me directly, just agreeing in that quiet way that made it seem like there was no real discussion to be had. I had smiled. Of course I had. I had spent years making sure he never felt caught between loyalty and comfort. So I made the choice easy for him. I agreed. That was how it always started. Small agreements. Small adjustments. Nothing that felt permanent on its own. A signature here. A conversation there. A decision framed as temporary that quietly became permanent. I thought about the drawer in the hallway where I used to keep important documents. Birth certificates, old insurance papers, things that carried weight even when you did not look at them often. One day, I noticed it had been reorganized. Not messy. Not careless. Just different. My papers had been moved. Some gone. When I asked about it, Sophia smiled and said she had tidied things up. I let it go. I let a lot of things go. Sitting there in the quiet of that parking lot, I began to see how each of those moments connected. Not random. Not accidental. Each one a step in a direction I did not realize I was being guided toward. By the time I noticed the path, I was already at the end of it. I reached over and opened my bag, pulling out the small notebook I had started carrying a few days ago. It was nothing special. just something I picked up at a discount store. But it had become important to me. A place where I could write things down exactly as they happened, without interpretation, without adjustment. Facts have a way of staying steady when everything else feels uncertain. I wrote down the date, the address of the property, the filing I had found, the names listed. I did not rush. I did not try to make sense of it all at once. I just recorded it, piece by piece. Because if there was one thing I understood now, it was this: the truth does not need to be forced. It just needs to be preserved long enough to be seen clearly. I paused for a moment, pen resting against the paper, and allowed myself to remember something I had not thought about in years. The day Daniel was born, the hospital room, the way he had wrapped his tiny hand around my finger, the promise I made to him without saying it out loud, that I would always be there, that I would always make sure he was safe. It is strange how those promises do not disappear, even when the person you made them to changes in ways you cannot recognize. I did not feel bitterness when I thought about him. Not yet. What I felt was distance. A quiet understanding that the version of my son I held on to existed somewhere in the past, untouched by the decisions he had made in the present. That realization did not break me. It steadied me, because it meant I could stop expecting something that was no longer there. I closed the notebook and set it beside me, my hand resting on it for a moment longer than necessary. The air inside the car had grown colder, the kind of chill that settles into your bones if you let it. I pulled my coat closer around me, adjusting it the way I had learned to do, conserving warmth, conserving energy, conserving everything. Outside, a car passed slowly, headlights sweeping across the windshield before fading into the distance. The world kept moving. It always does. I sat there, calm in a way that would have surprised me just days earlier, and understood something that changed everything. They had taken steps to remove me quietly, to rewrite the narrative in a way that protected them. But in doing so, they had created a record. And records, no matter how carefully crafted, can be read in more than one way. I did not need to confront them. Not yet. I did not need to explain anything. Not yet. All I needed to do was continue watching, continue documenting, continue letting the truth reveal itself fully. Because when the time came, I would not be speaking from emotion. I would be speaking from evidence. And that kind of truth does not need to raise its voice to be heard. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise, not because I had somewhere to be, but because staying still for too long made the reality harder to ignore. The windows of the car had fogged slightly from the cold, and for a moment, I just sat there, watching my own breath fade into the air. Then I reached for the notebook. It had become the first thing I touched each morning, even before the engine, even before the mirror. I flipped it open and read what I had written the night before. The words looked calm, steady, almost detached. That was intentional. Emotion changes memory. Facts do not. I added a few more notes. Dates I had remembered overnight. Small details that had resurfaced in my mind while I lay awake. The timing of the refinance. The week my access to the accounts quietly disappeared. The day Sophia suggested I should rest more and let them handle things moving forward. At the time, it sounded like care. Now it sounded like preparation. I closed the notebook and placed it back in my bag, then started the car. The engine took a second longer than usual to turn over. I listened to that delay carefully, the way you listen to anything you depend on when it is no longer guaranteed. Then it steadied, and I pulled out onto the road, joining the early morning traffic as if I belonged there like everyone else. That day, I did something different. Instead of going straight to the library, I drove past the neighborhood where Daniel lived. I did not turn onto his street right away. I slowed down at the corner, watching from a distance that felt both safe and unfamiliar. The house looked exactly the same. Fresh paint, trimmed hedges, the front porch clean and welcoming, as if it had never held a suitcase waiting for someone to leave. I stayed there for a few minutes, engine running, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. Then I saw movement. The front door opened, and Sophia stepped out first, holding a set of car keys in one hand and her phone in the other. She looked composed, the way she always did. Intentional. Controlled. Daniel followed a few seconds later, carrying a travel mug. They spoke briefly, something light, something easy. Then they got into their cars and drove off in opposite directions. I watched until both vehicles disappeared from view. Then I turned the wheel slowly and drove past the house. I did not stop. I did not park. I just passed it, like any other car on the street. But I noticed everything. The security camera mounted near the garage. The new lock on the front door. The absence of anything that suggested I had ever lived there. No trace. No sign. Clean. Efficient. I kept driving until I reached the end of the block, then turned onto a side street and parked under a tree where the branches cast long shadows across the pavement. I sat there quietly, letting the image settle in my mind. This was not just about what they had taken. It was about how completely they had removed any evidence that I had ever been part of that space. I reached for my phone and opened the county records again, scrolling through the documents with a slower, more deliberate focus. There were signatures, dates, witnesses, everything in place, everything appearing correct. But there was something else now, a pattern I had not fully understood before. The timing of the final transfer aligned almost perfectly with the last few weeks I was still living in that house, which meant something very specific. They had finalized everything while I was still there. While I was still sitting at that kitchen table, drinking my morning coffee, believing I was still part of the decisions being made around me. I lowered the phone and rested it on my lap, staring out through the windshield at the quiet street ahead. That realization did not come with anger. It came with clarity, a clean, undeniable understanding of intent. This had not been a reaction. It had been a plan carried out with patience and precision. And I had been present for all of it without seeing the full picture. I opened the notebook again and wrote down the new details. The dates, the alignment, the confirmation of what I had begun to suspect. My handwriting remained steady, even as the meaning behind the words grew heavier. When I finished, I closed the notebook and sat there for a moment longer, listening to the faint sound of wind moving through the trees. Then I looked back toward the direction of the house, even though I could no longer see it from where I was parked. I did not feel the urge to go back. I did not feel the need to confront anyone, because what mattered now was not what they would say. It was what could be proven. And for the first time since all of this began, I understood that I was no longer trying to hold on to what I had lost. I was preparing to understand exactly how it had been taken. By the time the afternoon settled in, I realized that knowing the truth and proving the truth were two very different things. One lives quietly in your mind. The other needs structure, patience, and the right moment to be seen. I drove back toward the library, not because I needed a place to sit, but because I needed access. Information is easier to understand when you can verify it more than once. I took the same seat near the back, opened my phone, and began searching again, this time with more intention. Property records had given me the outline, but outlines are not enough. I needed details. I needed context. Names that connected to other names. Dates that aligned with actions I could remember. It did not take long before I found something new. A secondary document tied to the property transfer. Not just a refinancing agreement, but a full restructuring. Ownership had not simply been adjusted. It had been consolidated. Cleanly. Completely. My name removed in a way that would not raise questions unless someone was specifically looking for it. Which meant someone had known exactly how to do this without drawing attention. I leaned back slightly in the chair, letting that thought settle. Daniel had always been practical, but not meticulous. He trusted systems. He did not study them. Sophia, on the other hand, paid attention to details. She asked questions others did not think to ask. She listened more than she spoke. I remembered how she used to sit at the edge of conversations, quiet, observant, absorbing information long before offering an opinion. At the time, I saw it as politeness. Now I understood it differently. I scrolled further, following the chain of documents until another name appeared. Not Daniel. Not Sophia. Someone else. A legal advisor. The same name appeared on multiple filings, not just for this property, but for several others in the area. Consistent. Repeated. Experienced. I wrote it down in the notebook carefully, underlining it once. Then I sat there, staring at that name for a few seconds longer than necessary. Because this was no longer just about a family matter. This had structure. Guidance. Someone had walked them through this process step by step, making sure everything looked correct on paper. I closed my eyes briefly, not out of exhaustion, but to organize the pieces in my mind. If there was a professional involved, then there would be records beyond what I had already seen. Consultations. Filings. Possibly even communication that connected timelines more clearly. The kind of details that do not disappear just because no one talks about them. I opened my eyes and reached for the computer terminal this time, not just my phone. Slower. More deliberate. Public access systems are not complicated, but they require patience. Search terms adjusted. Filters applied. Each step narrowing the field until something relevant appears. And eventually, it did. A filing date that matched a week I remembered clearly. The same week Sophia had insisted I take a few days to rest while they handled paperwork. The same week Daniel avoided eye contact more than usual, speaking in short, careful sentences that felt rehearsed even at the time. I stared at that date, letting it connect to the memory without forcing it. It fit too cleanly to be coincidence. That was the moment something shifted again, not in the facts, but in my understanding of them. They had not just acted quietly. They had acted while I was present, making decisions in rooms I was physically in, but no longer included in. The realization did not sting. It settled. Heavy but steady. I wrote the date down, adding it to the growing list of details that no longer felt scattered, but connected. Then I paused, pen hovering slightly above the page. There was a difference now in how I felt. Before, I was trying to understand what had happened. Now, I was beginning to understand how it had been done. And that difference mattered. Because understanding how something is done gives you insight into how it can be revealed. I closed the notebook again, placing it carefully back into my bag. Around me, the library remained quiet, unchanged. People moved between shelves, whispered conversations carried softly through the air, pages turned with the same steady rhythm as before. Nothing in that space reflected the shift that had just taken place inside me. But I felt it clearly. I was no longer searching for answers out of confusion. I was collecting them with purpose. And purpose has a way of changing how you move, how you think, how you wait. I stood up slowly, adjusting my coat, and walked toward the exit without rushing. Outside, the light had softened into early evening, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I paused for a moment beside my car, looking at my reflection faintly in the window. There was no visible change. The same face, the same posture, but something behind it had settled into place. They believed they had removed me from the story. They believed what was written on paper was enough to define what was real. But paper only holds what someone chooses to write. It does not control what can be uncovered. And I was no longer the person who would accept a version of events simply because it was presented neatly. I opened the car door, placed my bag on the passenger seat, and sat down with the same quiet focus I had carried all day. I did not know exactly when the moment would come, but I knew it would. Because truth, when documented carefully enough, does not stay hidden forever. It waits. And I had learned how to wait. The following days settled into a pattern that felt almost deliberate, as if the world itself had slowed down just enough for me to keep up with it. I did not rush anymore. There was no reason to. Rushing is for people who are reacting. I was no longer reacting. I was observing, recording, waiting. Each morning, I added something new to the notebook. Not always something big. Sometimes just a detail. Watch them constantly. People reveal more when they believe no one is paying attention. Instead, I checked their lives the way they presented them, through the small windows they had chosen to leave open. Social media, public appearances, the image they built for others. It was consistent, careful, almost polished. Dinner parties, weekend gatherings, smiling faces arranged around a table that looked warm, welcoming, complete. There was always a sense of balance in those photos. Nothing out of place, nothing missing. That was the detail that stood out the most. Nothing missing. Because I was missing. And yet, in their version of the story, there was no absence. Just the quiet implication that I had stepped away on my own. That I had chosen distance. That they had respected it. I watched those images without reacting. Without feeling the need to correct them. Because correcting something too early gives it strength. It invites defense. Explanation. Denial. I did not want any of that. Not yet. Instead, I let the story continue. Let them add to it. Let them make it more complete. Because the more complete a false story becomes, the more fragile it is when something real touches it. One afternoon, while sitting in the library, I noticed something I had not seen before. A post from Sophia about an upcoming gathering. A small event. Nothing extravagant. Just a group of friends, a few colleagues, people who knew them well enough to believe what they presented, but not well enough to question it deeply. The date caught my attention. It was only a week away. I read the details slowly, then read them again. It was not just a casual dinner. It was a celebration. Something about a new chapter and fresh beginnings. The language was familiar now. Vague, polished, carefully constructed to suggest progress without revealing specifics. I closed the application and sat there for a moment, letting the idea form without forcing it. A public setting. Familiar faces. A controlled environment where their version of events would be reinforced. That was not just a gathering. That was a stage. And stages have a way of amplifying whatever is placed on them. I did not smile. I did not react outwardly at all. But inside, something aligned. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just a quiet sense that the pieces I had been collecting were beginning to form a shape. That could be seen clearly from the outside, not just understood internally. I reached for the notebook and opened it to a clean page. I wrote down the date of the event, the location, the names I could identify from previous posts. Then I paused, pen resting lightly against the paper. There was no need to plan anything elaborate. No need to create something that would draw attention to itself. The truth, when placed in the right moment, does not need decoration. It stands on its own. But timing matters. Placement matters. And most of all, patience matters. I closed the notebook again and placed it carefully back in my bag. Around me, the same quiet rhythm continued. Pages turning, chairs shifting, the soft hum of a space where people came to focus, to think, to understand. I stood up and walked toward the exit, my movement steady, unhurried. Outside, the air carried that early evening chill again, the kind that reminds you how quickly the day can fade if you are not paying attention. I paused beside the car, looking out at the rows of vehicles, each one carrying someone with somewhere to go, something to return to. Then I opened the door and sat down, adjusting the coat beside me as I always did. The engine started on the first try this time. A small detail, but one I noticed. Because I had learned to notice everything. I rested my hands on the steering wheel for a moment before pulling out, my thoughts not scattered, not uncertain, but aligned in a way they had not been before. They believed the story was settled, that the version they had presented would remain untouched, unquestioned. But stories are not defined by how they begin, or even by how they are told. They are defined by what is revealed when everything is finally seen together, in full, without anything missing. And for the first time since all of this began, I knew exactly where that moment could happen. The day of the gathering arrived without any sense of urgency, which was exactly how I wanted it. Urgency leads to mistakes. Calm allows things to unfold the way they need to. I spent the morning the same way I had spent the last several mornings, sitting quietly in the driver's seat, reviewing the notes I had collected. Dates, names, documents, each one, steady, unchanged, waiting for the moment when they would no longer sit quietly on paper. I did not rush to get ready because there was nothing to prepare in the traditional sense. No outfit chosen to impress. No words rehearsed to persuade. Before reacting, Daniel followed a second later, his eyes meeting mine across the room. For a brief moment, there was something there. Not recognition. Not exactly. More like confusion trying to settle into something else. I did not step back. I did not raise my voice. I simply walked into the room as if I had always been expected. The air shifted, not dramatically, but enough to be felt. People moved slightly, creating space without realizing they were doing it. I stopped a few feet inside, allowing the room to settle around me before speaking. When I did, my voice was calm, steady, clear enough to carry without force. I did not address everyone. I did not need to. I looked at Daniel first, then at Sophia, then let my gaze move briefly across the room before returning to them. I heard there was a new beginning being celebrated. I said, my tone even, almost conversational. No accusation. No emotion layered over the words. Just a statement placed gently into the space. No one responded immediately. Silence has a way of expanding when it is not interrupted. Sophia was the first to speak, her voice measured, controlled. Margaret, this is not the time for this, she said, stepping slightly forward. Her smile present, but thinner now, more precise. I did not react to the words. I reached into my bag slowly, deliberately, and took out the notebook along with a small set of printed documents I had prepared earlier that day. I did not hand them out yet. I simply held them, visible but not presented, allowing the presence of them to register before their content was revealed. Then I spoke again, just as calmly as before. You told everyone I chose to leave, I said, not raising my voice, not changing my tone. I thought it might be important for them to understand how that decision was actually made. The room did not erupt. It did not need to. The shift was quieter than that. Subtle, but undeniable. Attention sharpened. Posture changed. The easy flow of the evening paused, replaced by something more focused, more aware. I did not rush the next moment. I let the silence hold just long enough for curiosity to settle into place. Because once curiosity takes hold, people begin to look more closely. And when people start looking closely, the truth does not need to fight to be seen. It simply needs to be shown. I did not move right away. I let the silence do what it needed to do. It stretched across the room, settling over conversations that had no place to go anymore. People were no longer looking at each other. They were looking at me. Not with judgment. Not yet. With attention. And attention, once it is focused, does not easily turn away. I stepped forward slowly, closing the distance by just enough to make what I was holding visible to more than a few people. The documents were simple. Clean copies. Dates clear. Signatures clear. Language intact. I did not wave them. I did not raise them. I simply held them the way you hold something that speaks for itself. I did not choose to leave. I said, my voice steady, measured, as if I were explaining something ordinary. I was removed from ownership of my own home while I was still living in it. A few people shifted where they stood. Not dramatically, just enough to signal that what they were hearing did not match what they had been told. I did not look at them. I kept my eyes on Daniel, then on Sophia, not to challenge them, not to confront them, just to make sure they understood that this was not a misunderstanding being corrected quietly. This was a truth being placed in the open. The paperwork was completed weeks before I left. I continued, my tone unchanged. My name was taken off everything. The house, the accounts, all of it. And I was not informed in a way that made that clear. Sophia took a step forward then, her expression tightening in a way that was almost imperceptible unless you knew what to look for. That is not accurate, she said quickly, her voice still controlled but no longer as smooth as before. You agreed to the changes. You signed the documents. I nodded once, a small, simple motion. I signed what I was told were adjustments, I replied calmly. Not a full transfer of ownership. Not a removal of my legal standing. There is a difference. I lifted the top document slightly, just enough for the printed lines to catch the light. And the timing of these filings shows exactly when that difference became final. No one interrupted this time. Not immediately. The room had shifted fully now. What had been a gathering built on comfort had become something else entirely. Not hostile. Not chaotic. Just aware. People were thinking. Connecting. Reconsidering. Daniel finally spoke, his voice quieter than I remembered, lacking the confidence he had carried earlier. Mom, this is not something you should be discussing like this, he said, his words careful, as if he were choosing them one at a time. I looked at him for a moment before responding. Not with anger. Not with disappointment. Just with clarity. It was discussed without me, I said. It was decided without me. It was finalized while I was still living there. This is simply the first time it is being said out loud. The words did not need emphasis. They settled into the room on their own. I could see it in the faces around me. The shift from assumption to uncertainty. From acceptance to questioning. No one needed to take sides. Not yet. All they needed to do was listen. I lowered the documents slightly, not hiding them, just returning them to a resting position in my hands. I did not come here to argue. I continued. And I am not asking anyone to choose who to believe. I paused briefly, letting the next words arrive without pressure. I am only making sure that the version of events being shared is complete. That was the moment it settled. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a quiet understanding that something had been missing from the story they had been given. And now it was there. Sophia did not speak again. Daniel did not move closer. The room held steady in that space between what was known and what was now being reconsidered. I took a small step back, not retreating, just creating distance. Enough to signal that I had said what I came to say. Nothing more was needed. I did not hand out the documents. I did not explain every detail. Because truth, when introduced properly, does not need to be forced into every conversation. It moves on its own, through questions, through quiet discussions that happen after the moment has passed. I turned toward the door, my movements as steady as they had been when I entered. No one stopped me. No one called after me. That was not the kind of moment this was. As I stepped outside, the air felt cooler, clearer, as if the weight of the room had remained behind me. I walked back to my car without looking back, not because I was avoiding anything, but because there was nothing left to confirm. The story had shifted. That was enough. I opened the car door, placed my bag on the passenger seat, and sat down, resting my hands lightly on the steering wheel before starting the engine. The night stretched quietly ahead, unchanged, steady, moving forward the way it always does. And for the first time since all of this began, I was no longer part of a story being told about me. I had told it myself. And that made all the difference.